All right, students, going to be talking with you today about the Jefferson-Hemings controversy. Okay, so a little bit of background on that and a little bit of background on Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings, her dates are 1773 through 1835. She's one of the most famous, yet one of the least known African American women in United States history. And hopefully that is starting to change through the efforts of historians and those that are now in charge of Monticello. And we're starting to learn more and more and accept more and more of the history that is out there about Sally Hemings. So I'll offer a little timeline of events in relation to Sally Hemings as a history kind of during her life will be the conversation, but then sort of what takes place after her relationship with Jefferson becomes sort of public knowledge, right? And how it's refuted over time. Okay. Now, her name has been linked to Thomas Jefferson for more than 200 years. Okay. And we're going to talk about exactly how that connection comes into play. She is linked to Jefferson as his concubine. And this is a lot of what has obscured the facts about her identity and has led to denial from even those that are members of the Jefferson family in the 1800s, but even later, right? And I'll get into some breakthroughs that we've had in understanding the history through like a DNA study. And just over time, the evidence has really mounted up. So I want everybody listening to kind of get a sense of who Sally Hemings was, right? And this is something I took from the Monticello.org digital exhibition, but Sally Hemings is a daughter. And she's somebody's daughter. She's also a mother. She's a sister. She's an aunt. She is an inherited piece of property, right? She was a seamstress, a world traveler, but also an enslaved woman, a concubine, a negotiator, a liberator, and a mystery, as we will get into. So on September 1st, 1801, James T. Callender, a newspaperman that Jefferson had hired previously to run a story about some stuff going on with the, he had hired Callender to kind of talk poorly about Madison, right? Not Madison, rather, John Adams. And this was during Adams' term in office and before Jefferson runs against him for president. So he and Jefferson had falling out. I'll go into more detail on it in a moment. But what happened is that he runs this story about Jefferson having a slave mistress named Sally Hemings and states that Jefferson was the father of her children. Okay. So Sally Hemings remains one of these enigmatic details that surrounds Jefferson's life. So we know from Jefferson's plantation and farm records that Sally Hemings was one of Jefferson's inherited slaves and arrived in Monticello as a toddler around the age of 3. And Jefferson inherited Sally as well as over 100 additional slaves when his father-in-law died. Now here's the thing. Sally's mother had been Jefferson's father-in-law, John Wales's mistress, and Sally is thought to be the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha. Okay. Now, Sally Hemings has 7 total children during her life, 4 of which lived to adulthood. Their names are Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Beverly and Harriet are freed in 1822, and Madison Eston are freed in Jefferson's will. So we don't know what Sally Hemings looked like, and she left no writings, which was a common consequence of being a slave. But we do believe that she was literate. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the Hemings family going, kind of getting up to Sally Hemings. So a few comments first about this DNA study, and I'll follow up more on this at the end of the lecture. In November of '98, there was a DNA study done that finds that Thomas Jefferson likely did have a sexual relationship with Hemings and fathered her children. And this is when the history really starts to change on the topic. This story, though, had been passed down through 200 years of consistent family oral history through the Hemings family. And this is often refuted up until, like I said, this DNA study on the evidence becomes insurmountable, in my opinion. So in 1873, Sally's son, Madison Hemings, was the first person to put the story into the public record by giving an interview to an Ohio paper stating that his mother, Sally, had told him on her deathbed that Thomas Jefferson was the father of he and his siblings. Now, Madison was a well-known ex-slave that lived in the community of Ohio, in Ohio, where this newspaper, where he gives this interview. And all of his neighbors knew the story of his purported lineage and parentage. Again, some historians and scholars still refute this story and these connections. Now, Sally's grandmother, born in West Africa in the mid-1700s, she was rounded up, forced onto a slave ship, and given to an English captain, the captain of an English trading ship whose name was John Hemings. She becomes pregnant with his child. This produced a daughter named Elizabeth Hemings, or Betty, who would grow up a slave on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. So remark here that Betty would be half white. A man named John Wales takes Betty as his concubine and has 6 children with her, one named Sally Hemings. John Wales was the father of Martha Wales, who would marry Thomas Jefferson the year before Sally was born. Sally's born in 1773. Her father and 3 of her grandparents were white. She was 3/4 white, but she was still considered black by societal standards, and she was still a slave. So Martha's father died the year after she married Jefferson, and that is when Jefferson inherited lands, slaves, and the debts of John Wales. He sells most of the lands, pays off the debts, keeps the slaves. Betty and all her children go to Jefferson, are listed in his farm records with their last names. That's rare. Slaves are typically referred to by first names only as a way to reduce their personal identity. So some of the Hemings children looked almost completely white by accounts of those who knew them. And as we will talk later, they integrate into white society as white people. So about Sally's childhood. As a young girl, Sally helped out with childcare around for the plantation owner, Jefferson, as well as gaining additional responsibilities as she got older, things like weaving, spinning, making cloth, being trained to perform certain skills at Monticello. Now, Sally worked alongside her mother, Betty, as well as her siblings. Now, here's a few remarks on Jefferson during the time that Sally Hemings would have been a child. Okay, so Jefferson has all these slaves, but he blames King George III for the slave trade in the Declaration of Independence. And early on, an earlier draft calls for its abolishment, but that passage is rejected. It's too controversial. So even as a slave owner, Jefferson is trying to get rid of the institution, but he never frees Sally Hemings, right? Never frees all of his slaves. Anyway, Jefferson returned to Monticello and served as governor of Virginia for the remainder of the American Revolution after authoring the Declaration. While his slaves at Monticello, Sally Hemings included, maintained their way of life, making sure that the day-to-day operations of the plantation went on. Martha Jefferson, during this time, gives birth to 5 children during the first 9 years of her marriage to Thomas Jefferson, and only 2 daughters had survived, and this devastates her health. She gives birth to a 6th child, Lucy, in 1782, right near the end of the Revolution. She is just, as I mentioned, wrecked from these complicated births and just of poor health. She is going to pass away ultimately, and on her deathbed, she allegedly gives this bell to 9-year-old Sally at the time. Martha's only 37 at the time of her death. And there's a rumor that on her deathbed, Martha Jefferson made Jefferson promise that he would never marry again. So let's talk about Paris, okay? Thomas Jefferson is going to go to Paris as a diplomat to France. Sally would continue to serve Jefferson's daughters, Patsy, Polly, and the newborn Lucy at Monticello. Jefferson is just grief-stricken by his wife's death, and that's part of why he accepts his post as an American minister in Paris in 1784. And he takes his oldest daughter, Patsy, and Sally's older brother, James Hemings. Sally stays behind initially. Now, Sally was sent to live with Polly and Lucy and an aunt and uncle's plantation, where she would wait on and serve the 2 daughters of Jefferson. Both of the daughters during this time contract whooping cough. Lucy dies. After this, he sent for Polly to come to France. Now, another middle-aged slave was supposed to accompany Polly but fell ill, so Sally came with Polly to France in her place. They crossed the Atlantic and arrived in London and were met by John Adams and Abigail Adams. Sally, around this time, would have been 14 or 15 years old. Now, Sally stayed in London with Polly and would move on from there with her to Paris. Now, smallpox during this time was a problem in Europe. Polly was inoculated when she arrived and quarantined in the countryside for several weeks. And she would be brought to live in Paris in 1787. Now, while Sally was there, she was tutored in the French language and was given training as a lady's maid. She was instructed in hairstyling, fashion, taught how to launder fine linens and clothing, was taught dressmaking, and according to her son Madison, she was just starting to understand the French language when she leaves France to return to the United States. So Sally would have experienced a certain level of freedom while in Paris, because slavery does not exist there as an institution. Right? Slavery is been abolished in France. Sally was paid as a servant while she was in Paris. James was being trained in the art of French cooking and was helping Sally learn French customs and culture, and he was also being paid for his services. Now, Sally is in Paris for a total of 26 months, so over 2 years. In her correspondence with friends back home, Patsy mentions Sally in her letters. Madison Hemings states that during Sally's time in Paris is when she becomes Jefferson's concubine. Now, scholars that agree Hemings was Jefferson's mistress agree with this timeline and that Sally would be between 14 and 15 years old. Jefferson would have been 43 when they began their relationship. Now, Jefferson was with Sally during the day while his daughters were at school. In 1789, the French Revolution begins, and also Jefferson's daughter Patsy, who had been receiving an education at a convent, threatens to convert to Catholicism. These two things prompt Jefferson to remove her from the convent and also make plans to return to Virginia. According to Madison Hemings, Sally is pregnant during this time. And Madison also states that Sally initially refuses to return to the United States and that she negotiated extraordinary privileges for herself once she returns to Monticello and for the freedom of her future children. Jefferson promised that he would free Sally's children at the age of 21. Now, there's also James. Jefferson convinces James also to return to Virginia, promising him freedom if he would stay long enough to teach someone the skills he had acquired as a cook, and perhaps Sally negotiated that in. It's speculated. Sally gives birth to a child soon after they return to Virginia that dies. There are no surviving records of this child or its gender. Madison Hemings states that it lived for but a short time. So back at Monticello, Sally Hemings is a slave again. She becomes pregnant also a second time in 1795, giving birth to a daughter named Harriet. This will be one of two children named Harriet that's born to Sally Hemings. It is born in October and dies 2 years later at the age of 2 in 1797. Jefferson is verifiably home during this time period of this second child's conception. In 1796, Jefferson loses the presidential election to John Adams and becomes the vice president for Adams. And in April of 1798, 25-year-old Sally gives birth to her first recorded son, Beverly. And this pattern begins to emerge that all children are conceived when Jefferson is at Monticello. Beverly will grow up to become a carpenter and also a talented fiddle player. Now, following Patsy Jefferson's orders, her aunt, Patsy Jefferson is Sally's aunt. Anything that Patsy tells Sally to do, she has to do. And this was also her half-sister's child. So Patsy Jefferson, her mother, Martha, is Sally's half-sister. So also, by 1799, there's a political war going on between Jefferson and Adams. This is where this issue comes back up with the James T. Callender, the newspaper man that Jefferson had hired. So Jefferson hired a newspaper man, Callender, who ended up in jail for being critical of John Adams in doing this at Jefferson's behest, right? Adams had passed laws that you couldn't be critical of the president, so he jailed him, right? Now, when Jefferson wins the presidency in March of 1801, Callender's released from jail. Jefferson had everyone pardoned who was arrested under the Sedition Act. And Callender had been in jail for a year. So Jefferson is famous for the act of patronage, putting all of his friends and supporters in government positions that helped him get there. So Callender requests to be postmaster of Richmond and also to have his $200 fine paid. Well, Jefferson basically just cuts ties with Callender. So a year after being denied his appointment, Callender turns on Jefferson, picks up evidence of Jefferson's relationship with Hemings, talking to Jefferson's neighbors and elsewhere, and he breaks the story in September of 1802, calling Sally Hemings Dusky Sally, also referring to her as the African Venus. He explained the origins of the relationship in Paris and that they had children together. Callender refers to her by name and calls her Jefferson's concubine. Now, Jefferson never responded to any of this, right? To any of the charges that Sally Hemings was his mistress. His followers and supporters denied it. What was undeniable, though, is that there was a slave at Monticello named Sally Hemings, who had gone to Paris with Jefferson and who was inherited from his father-in-law. Jefferson said, "The man who fears no truths has nothing to fear from lies." John Adams, even not a friend of Jefferson at this time, said he did not believe the charges brought against Jefferson. Stated to his wife that the charges were a natural and unavoidable consequence of the foul contagion in the human character, Negro slavery. This story does not negatively impact Jefferson's first term in office in really any way. And in 1804, he wins an easy re-election in a landslide. There's a political cartoon that circulates during this election cycle, though, depicting Jefferson as a rooster with Sally as his hen. It's two chickens with a Jefferson caricature on one head and a Sally Hemings caricature on the other. It was titled The Philosophic Cock. So no one knows if Sally had any reaction to this scandal, if she even knew about it. And it's not known for sure, again, if she was literate or if she could have been reading the papers, because she left no writings behind. In 1801, a daughter named Harriet, this is the second child named Harriet, the first one was passed away, is born, and she goes on to become a spinner in Jefferson's textile factory later on. At the age of 35, Sally gives birth to Madison Hemings in January of 1805. Like Beverly, Madison would go on to become a carpenter. 3 years after giving birth to Madison, she gave birth to another boy, Eston Hemings, in May of 1808. So at the age of 65, this is when Thomas Jefferson's political career starts slowing down. He's been in the Washington administration. He's been a vice president. He's served 2 terms as president, the second of which would come to an end in 1809. And at that time, he returned to Monticello. His oldest daughter, Patsy, moved to Monticello with her 11 children, where Jefferson took a patriarchal role of the family. Now, according to the Hemings children, Jefferson did not show any affection whatsoever towards his mixed-race children that he had fathered with Hemings. In 1822, Beverly and Harriet Hemings, Sally's older children, were noted in Jefferson's records as runaways. Now, Jefferson had a history of recovering escaped slaves and returning them to Monticello, but he did not do this with Beverly and Harriet. There's actually evidence that Harriet was given $50 and put on a stagecoach. Both children passed into white society. They passed as white and married and had children and moved on. Now, a few more notes on freedom here. So, On July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson dies. In his will, he freed 5 of his 130 slaves, all members of the Hemings family. Among them were a 21-year-old Madison and 18-year-old Eston Hemings. Jefferson also petitioned legislature asking for them to be able to stay in Virginia. Now, the law of the time is that if they stayed in the state for 1 year, they could be enslaved again. So he petitions to have this not be applicable to Madison and Eston. Now, they both stay as freedmen in Virginia. Jefferson did not free Sally in his will, but his daughter gave Sally her time after his death, as it was called. This meant you would let a slave go, not recapture them. So she leaves Monticello with her 2 sons, goes to live with her 2 sons, rather, in Charlottesville, near Monticello. She dies 9 years after Thomas Jefferson at the age of 62. Madison and Eston lived as Black men after their mother died. They moved to Ohio. Eston moved to Wisconsin, eventually integrated with white society. In the 1830 census, Sally, Madison, and Eston are listed as free white people. There's a follow-up census done a couple years later following the Nat Turner Rebellion that lists Sally as a free mulatto who had lived in Charlottesville since 1826. So let's talk about some timeline of the sources and of the sort of story behind the Jefferson-Hemings controversy and Jefferson's purported parentage of Sally Hemings' children. So we have over 200 years of oral history on the topic that we can access. Now, that's often ignored. In many cases, people are still ignoring it. But I will sort of go over where things are to this day, me giving this talk in 2020. So there's the calendar story that breaks in 1802. This is the beginning of the timeline. And here's what he said. It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps, and for many past has kept as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. This was the first public acknowledgement of Sally's existence. Then there's the engraving from 1804, the Philosophic Cock, which depicts Jefferson as a strutting rooster and his concubine, Sally Hemings, as his hen. Journal entries from one of Jefferson's friends, James Hartwell Cock, or it could be Cook or Coke, it's C-O-C-K-E. He comments on Jefferson keeping a substitute of a wife, and this is later, like 1850s. And he states that this is prevalent, not uncommon in the South. Now, in 1974, Fawn Brodie publishes a book, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, which makes the case that Jefferson is the father of Hemings' children. In 1993, Monticello launches the Getting Word African American Project, interviewing over 200 descendants from Monticello's enslaved community and their oral histories, right? So 97, starting to stack up here. The University Press of Virginia publishes Annette Gordon Reed's Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. Now this challenged the arguments against Jefferson's paternity of Hemings' children. In 1998, there's a DNA study published in the Journal of Nature, which established that a male with a Jefferson Y chromosome was the father of Eston Hemings. DNA evidence examined Eston Hemings' great-grandson's blood against that of several Jefferson's relatives to see if the Y chromosomes matched, and the test was positive, and they were genetically related to Jefferson. Study ruled out the previous claim from 1858 by Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Coolidge, that one of Jefferson's car nephews was the father of Hemings' children. This evidence is what makes it most probable that Jefferson's the father of Hemings' children. In a 2000 report by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, it's concluded that there's a high probability that Thomas Jefferson is the father of Eston Hemings and is likely the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children listed in the Monticello records. In 2001, the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society publishes the Jefferson-Hemings Controversy, a report on the Scholars Commission challenging the conclusions of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, citing that Jefferson's younger brother Randolph was most likely the father of the Hemings children. Before the DNA study topic emerged, this theory of Jefferson's fathering children with Hemings had been discredited. Now, racism, according to many scholars, definitely often plays a role in people denying this. Now, in 2017, the Monticello Foundation announced that they believed a room in the south wing of Monticello to have been where Sally Hemings lived as an adult. The room's 14 feet, 3 inches wide, 13 feet long, constructed in 1809, went unnoticed for decades, and then in 1941 was converted into a men's restroom. This room was right adjacent to Jefferson's bedroom. The relationship between Hemings and Jefferson still has a shadow of doubt hanging over it for some, and the many questions surrounding their relationship may never be answered. Monticello Foundation, however, who owns and operates Monticello, considers Jefferson to be the father of Hemings' children, and the matter's settled despite any public criticism or denial. All right, everybody, thank you for listening to my talk on the Jefferson-Hemings controversy. We'll talk to you all soon.